It was a Tuesday afternoon, middle of October, and I ran into Mike at the hardware store, the one on Route 9, the big orange one, you know the type. Mike and I both retired from Ashford Manufacturing the same year, 2019. Same pension formula, give or take, similar savings. Mike was a plant supervisor for the last 12 years of his career. Solid guy, not flashy, not reckless. He retired with a plan. His plan was to keep most of his money in savings accounts because, as he told me at the time, he wanted to be able to sleep at night. I hadn't seen Mike in almost a year. He was standing in the plumbing aisle holding a box of pipe fittings, and he had that look on his face that I've seen a few times in retired men. Not panic, not despair, just a kind of quiet confusion. Like the numbers are almost adding up, but not quite, and he can't figure out why. We talked for maybe 15 minutes next to the PVC connectors, and near the end of the conversation, Mike said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said, "Gary, I feel like I'm doing everything right and falling behind at the same time. How is that possible?" He wasn't broke, he wasn't in trouble, but he felt like something was slipping, quietly, and he couldn't point to what it was. That's why I'm recording this video. I'm Gary Mercer. I spent 29 years fixing problems in manufacturing. In retirement, I had to fix this one myself. I'm not going to tell you retirement is what they show in the brochure. This channel is like having a retired friend who tells you what it actually looks like. Subscribe and you'll never walk this road alone. I'm not giving you investment advice, but I am going to tell you what I watched happen to people I know. It was the spring of 2021, about 2 years into retirement, and I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a legal pad in front of me. My wife had gone out to run errands. The house was quiet. I had the kind of quiet that used to feel like a reward when I was working, and now just felt like a lot of empty space. I don't know exactly what made me do it that morning. Maybe it was a receipt I'd tossed on the table the night before after picking up groceries. Maybe I'd been half aware of a nagging feeling for a few weeks and finally decided to sit down with it. Whatever it was, I picked up a pen and started writing down numbers. Not in any formal way. I wasn't running a spreadsheet or doing a proper financial review. I was just doing what I used to do when something felt off in one of my facilities. I was looking at the numbers the way you look at a machine that's running slightly too loud. You're not sure there's a problem yet, but something's telling you to look. I wrote down the balance in our main savings account. Then I wrote down what we'd had in that same account when I retired in 2019. Then I wrote down what I remembered groceries costing, roughly, in those first months after retirement. A typical weekly shop, the kind we did every Thursday. Then I wrote down what we'd spent last Thursday. The gap wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't the kind of thing you see and immediately pick up the phone. But it was there, and it was real. And what got me was that it was completely silent. Nobody had sent me a letter. No alarm had gone off. My savings account balance, which I checked from time to time with the mild satisfaction of a man who'd worked hard and saved carefully, still had a perfectly respectable number in it. But when I sat there with the legal pad doing the actual arithmetic, what things cost now versus what they cost 2 years ago, what the balance was now versus what it was then, how much we'd drawn down and how much the purchasing power of what remained had shifted, I realized I was quietly losing ground. I sat there for a while after I finished writing. I looked out the window at the backyard. There's a big oak back there that I've always liked. I thought about the fact that I'd spent 3 decades managing production schedules and inventory and operational efficiency across 3 separate facilities, and I'd never once sat down and done this particular kind of math for myself. Not really. I'd assumed that what I'd built was solid, and that sitting still was the same as holding your position. It isn't. That's the thing nobody tells you clearly. Sitting still in retirement isn't neutral. Sitting still costs money, and it costs it quietly, in a way that doesn't feel like spending. I refilled my coffee and sat back down with the legal pad. I wrote at the top, "What is actually happening here?" And underneath that, I started writing what I actually knew, as opposed to what I'd assumed. That morning at the kitchen table was the first time I really understood that the thing I thought was protecting me, a large pile of cash sitting in a savings account, untouched and safe, wasn't doing exactly what I'd thought it was doing. It was doing something, but it wasn't doing that. Let me tell you what I mean. I spent 30 years in manufacturing with a management philosophy that served me extremely well. Always have a reserve, always have a buffer. If you're running a production line and you don't have a buffer of raw materials, you're one supplier delay away from shutting down. If you don't have a reserve budget for equipment failure, you're one broken conveyor away from missing a delivery date. I built my entire operational approach around the principle that the unexpected will happen, and you need to be positioned to absorb it without going sideways. That mentality made me good at my job. My facilities ran tight and resilient. We didn't panic when things went wrong because we'd planned for things going wrong. And when I retired, I carried that same mentality into my personal finances, without ever stopping to ask whether the rules were the same. They're not. In my working years, the buffer made sense for a specific reason. There was a paycheck coming in on the 15th and the 30th of every month. The buffer was a shock absorber. If I dipped into it, I rebuilt it. The system replenished itself by design. The cash reserve was defensive, and it worked because the offense, the income, was always running. In retirement, the offense stops. Or it changes shape, anyway. The pension comes in, Social Security comes in, but there's no production bonus, no annual review, no overtime. What you have is more or less what you have. And when the cash sitting in savings accounts is simply sitting there, earning less than the rate at which prices are rising around it, it isn't a buffer anymore. It's a slowly deflating tire. I noticed this in the most ordinary ways, over the first 6 years of retirement, at the most ordinary places. I noticed it at the checkout line at our grocery store, the one on Maple, the mid-size regional chain, nothing fancy. The same cart of food that cost me somewhere around $130 in the fall of 2019, I was paying around $180 for by 2023. I didn't track it obsessively, I'm not that guy. But I'm also not unobservant. And when you shop at the same store, buy roughly the same things, and you watch the total on the screen go up year after year without buying anything different or better, you notice. I noticed it at the mechanic shop. I've got a truck I've driven since 2017. Nothing exotic, American make, basic configuration. In 2019, a routine service, oil change, inspection, tire rotation, ran me about $80 to $90. By last year, the same shop, the same truck, the same services, I'm paying north of $140. And when I needed a new set of tires 2 years ago, I almost laughed at the number. I didn't laugh because it wasn't funny. I noticed it at the pharmacy, at the hardware store, at the home improvement place when I had to replace a section of guttering. Each individual item, each individual service, not dramatically more expensive in isolation, but added together, over 6 years, lived against a cash balance that was staying still. The math starts to feel personal. The cash in the savings account felt safe because it had a number on it, and the number didn't go down on its own. That's the illusion. The number stays the same, but the world around it changes. What that number buys is the actual measure of its value, and that's the part that moves without you touching anything. The safety you feel holding a large cash balance in retirement is real as a feeling. It is not necessarily real as a fact. And the gap between those two things is what I sat with at my kitchen table that Saturday morning in 2021. Here's what I've come to believe, and I want to be precise about what kind of belief this is. It's not a financial theory, it's a psychological observation. The reason I held more cash than I probably needed in the first years of retirement wasn't really about inflation. I didn't sit down and run the numbers and make a rational decision that cash was the right vehicle for my savings. I held cash because holding cash felt like control. And control, for someone who spent 30 years being the person who kept things running, is not just a preference. It's closer to an identity. When you're a VP of operations, the fix is always within reach. Machine goes down, you get the maintenance crew. Supplier delays, you work the phone and find another supplier. Labor shortage on the floor. You pull from another shift, you call the temp agency, you solve it. The currency of your professional life is your ability to intervene, to have resources available, to never be caught without options. Cash, in that context, is options. Cash is the ability to respond. Cash is competence made liquid. I didn't realize until I'd been retired for a couple of years that I was carrying this psychology into a context where it didn't apply the same way. In retirement, there are no production emergencies at 2 in the morning. There's nothing to fix in the same immediate, decisive way. And when you've built your entire sense of professional value around being the one who fixes things, and suddenly there's nothing that needs fixing in that particular way, the cash reserves become something different. They become a kind of security blanket, not against financial risk specifically, but against the disorientation of no longer being needed in the way you used to be needed. I held cash because I didn't trust that I was okay without the next paycheck coming in. That wasn't a financial problem, that was a psychological one. The paycheck, when I was working, wasn't just money, it was confirmation. Every 2 weeks, the company was telling me, "You're still essential, you're still solving problems, you're still worth this number." When that stopped, the cash pile became a substitute for that confirmation, a way of telling myself that I still had resources, I was still in control, I was still the kind of man who had reserves. That's a completely understandable response to retirement. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that understanding it changed how I thought about what I was actually doing with my money, and why. I want to tell you about Dave because Dave's story is one I think about more than he probably realizes. Dave and I worked together for about 14 years. Different departments. He was on the supply chain side, I was operations. But we'd had lunch together probably once a month for most of that time. Good man, sharp, the kind of person who arrived at meetings having already thought about the problem from 3 angles. He retired about 8 months before I did and was very deliberate about it. He had a number, he hit the number, he shook hands with the CEO and walked out the door. I had lunch with Dave maybe 2 years into his retirement. We met at a diner we'd gone to a few times over the years, the one with the vinyl booths and the good pie. And about halfway through the meal, Dave said something that stuck with me. He said he'd been watching his savings account balance the way he used to watch production reports. Every day, almost. Not because he needed to, but because he didn't know what else to look at. He said watching the balance stay more or less the same felt like a measure of success, even though he knew he was drawing from it. What bothered Dave, and what he articulated better than I could have at the time, was that the balance wasn't really telling him anything useful anymore. In a production context, you watch the numbers because the numbers tell you whether the system is working. The number goes up, good. The number goes down, intervention required. In retirement, what does the number going down mean? You took a trip. You repaired something. You lived. At what number is it okay for the number to go down? Dave didn't have a clear answer for that, and not having a clear answer made him hold more than he needed to in cash, close and visible, where he could see it not going down. Then there's my neighbor Raymond. Raymond retired from a career in civil engineering, county infrastructure, road systems, that sort of thing. He and I talk over the fence sometimes when we're both outside. Last spring, he told me something that I found both completely understandable and a little heartbreaking. He said he'd been in retirement for 3 years and he still hadn't taken a single trip he'd planned for retirement, even though he could afford them, because every time he went to move money for a trip, he froze. The money just sat there. He said it felt wrong to spend it when nothing was coming in to replace it. What I thought after that conversation was that Raymond wasn't describing a financial problem at all. He was describing the psychological experience of being, for the first time in his adult life, a spender rather than a saver. His whole identity around money had been built on accumulation. He'd never had to build an identity around spending because spending was always the thing you did after you saved enough. He'd saved enough, and now he couldn't spend. Not because the money wasn't there, because he didn't know how to be a person who spent rather than saved. Both of those conversations, Dave and Raymond, made me look harder at my own behavior and my own hesitations. And eventually I came to understand something that I think is worth saying plainly. The cash issue wasn't really about cash. I managed 3 facilities. In my last few years at Ashford, the head count under my direction was close to 200 people. I had direct reports who managed other direct reports, who managed shift supervisors, who managed floor workers, and all of it flowed up to me in one way or another. When something went wrong, people looked for me. When something needed to be decided, people called me. When a crisis hit, equipment failure, safety incident, production shortfall, there was a process, and I was the top of that process. My value was legible. It was measured in output and uptime and efficiency ratios and customer satisfaction scores. I knew who I was because the organization told me who I was every single day. When I retired, all of that stopped. Not gradually, immediately. The phone stopped ringing. The decision chain stopped running through me. I went from being an essential node in a large system to being a man in a house in the Midwest with a very organized garage. And the transition was stranger than I expected, even though I'd been preparing for it. The hardest part wasn't the money. The hardest part was figuring out who I was when nobody needed me to be anything. The cash hoard was part of my answer to that question, and I didn't even realize it. Having a large, visible reserve was a way of maintaining the feeling of being the guy who had resources, who had options, who could handle whatever came up. It was operations brain applied to personal finance. It was the VP in me, still running the facility, long after there was no facility to run. I don't say this to be harsh about it. It makes complete sense that a person would respond to a major identity transition by reaching for the tools that always made them feel competent. But eventually, you have to ask whether those tools are actually serving you in the new context, or whether you're just carrying them out of habit. What eventually changed for me wasn't a specific account I opened, or a rate I found, or a strategy I adopted. I don't talk about strategies on this channel, and I'm not going to start now. What changed was simpler than that, and also harder than that. I changed my understanding of what money is for. When I was working, money was largely a means of maintaining stability and building towards something. You earned, you saved, you buffered, you invested in the future you were building. Money's job was to grow, or at minimum to hold. That was the frame. In retirement, money's job is different, and I didn't fully accept that until a few years in. The frame I eventually found useful, and this came to me oddly through a woodworking project, is this. You don't stockpile lumber for a project you might do someday. You get what you need for the project you're actually doing. I'd been putting off building a workbench in my garage. Nothing complicated, just a proper work surface with storage. I'd been gathering materials for it in a vague way for about a year and a half, buying boards when I thought I might need them, stacking them against the wall, telling myself I was being prepared. What I was actually doing was delaying the project while creating the feeling of making progress on it. One afternoon, I sat down and drew up what I actually needed for the specific bench I actually wanted to build. It was less than half of what I'd accumulated. The rest was just lumber taking up space. Money in retirement works something like that. You don't need a reserve for every possible project you might someday undertake. You need what actually serves the life you're actually living. And the life you're actually living has a shape. It has actual costs, actual goals, actual plans. What is the project of your retirement? Not the theoretical one, the brochure one, the real one. When you answer that question honestly, the amount of cash you actually need sitting still becomes a lot clearer. If I could go back and have a conversation with myself at 57 years old, 2 years before I retired, I wouldn't talk about accounts or rates. I genuinely would not. The people who need to tell you about that are professionals with a license and a fiduciary duty, and I'm neither of those things. What I would talk about is something nobody mentioned to me, not once, in all the pre-retirement planning conversations I had. I would talk about the psychology of going from adding to spending, because that transition is a genuinely difficult one, and it doesn't get discussed. You spend 40 years building. Every year the number goes up. And the going upness of the number is how you know you're doing it right. Then you retire, and the number stops going up the way it used to, and you start drawing from it, and your entire relationship with money has to change. The behaviors and instincts that made you good at accumulating don't automatically make you good at deploying. They can actually work against you. I would tell my 57-year-old self, The goal in retirement is not to preserve the number at the expense of the life. The number is a tool. It is not the destination. The destination is the thing you're building with it. And if the lumber is just sitting in a stack against the wall, that is not the same as the workbench. I would tell him, the cash you're holding because it feels safe is not the same as the cash you're holding because it's the right amount for the life you're actually planning to live. Know the difference. I would tell him, pay attention to who you think you are without the title, because that's the real work of retirement, and the money stuff is downstream of it. I've been retired 6 years. I still don't have it all figured out, but I've got enough to talk about. If you've made it to this part of the video, do me a favor. Write in the comments how long you've been retired, and what's the one financial thing nobody warned you about. I read every comment on this channel, every single one. Not because I have an algorithm to feed, because those comments are real people describing real situations, and I think that's worth attention. If this video was useful to you, subscribe, and share it with someone you know who's either just retired or getting close. The conversations we don't have before retirement are the ones that end up costing us later, sometimes in money, usually in something harder to measure than that. I'm Gary Mercer. I'll see you in the next one. And if you're feeling like you're doing everything right and still falling behind somehow, you're not alone in that. You're just not done figuring it out yet.